Hey scholars, Miss Alicia here. Welcome to my kindness corner. All right, we're going on to chapter 7, the end of the race. So before we go there, go to the end of the race, I want you to think for just a second. Think about maybe like a foreshadowing. What do you think? How do you think it's going to end? Do you think the Sea Raven's going to win? Do you think the Wild Bull is going to make it first? What do you think is going to happen? So get that in your head, and then let's go ahead and start chapter 7, the end of the race. When the Lady Wilma entered the blue bay of Calo, Jack counted 31 ships at the anchor. He was disappointed that nowhere to be seen was the high-riding Sea Raven. "She's loaded up with coal and fresh water," snapped Captain Swain. "Loaded up and skedaddled." Nevertheless, smiles were in order for the day. After months at sea, the gold seekers looked upon the sunny little town as if it was Paris or London. They couldn't wait to get ashore. Hardly the mooring lines had been thrown out like bullwhips when men began to leap to the wharf. "Master Jack, shall we go ashore?" said Praiseworthy. "I'd like that just fine," smiled Jack. Jack posted another letter home to Boston. The streets thronged with sailors and gold seekers, and in the distance the great Andes rose like painted scenery. The town was a great deal larger than the ship they had just left at the fueling wharf, but it was land, dry land. Jack had almost forgotten the smell of dust in his nostrils. He breathed it in like perfume. The butler and the boy rode about on mules all day, and had all the excitement of a picnic. Late in the afternoon, Mr. Azariah Jones hailed them in the sunny plaza. "Look here," he beamed. "I bought the last pick and shovel in town. Since the California fever started, the shelves are bare, I can tell you. And a washpan thrown in for good measure. They're yours." "Voila!" said Monsieur Gaunt, appearing out of the crowd and dropping a pick and shovel at their feet. "I've got my hands on the last two ones in town, and a washpan too, friends." Then he stopped to glare at the Yankee trader, who was already glaring at him. "Gentlemen," smiled Praiseworthy, "I think we can safely say that you have found the last two picks and shovels left in Gallo. They're bound to bring us luck, Master Jack and I." His words of gratitude were interrupted by the clanging of the Wilma's bell, calling the gold seekers back to their ship. "Hurry, boys!" shouted Mountain Jim. "The Wild Bull of the Seas would be mighty glad to leave without us." There was a wild rush for the wharf, but when Jack turned, Praiseworthy was no longer standing beside him. Jack's hair nearly stood on end. The butler was gone. "Praiseworthy!" The ship's bell rang through the air, but Jack didn't know which way to run. He couldn't leave Praiseworthy behind. Hadn't he heard the ship's warning bell? What had happened to him? Praiseworthy! Jack was unable to move, as if the anchored to the spot with the pick and shovel. He had to fight back welling up tears. The Lady Wilma would leave without them. And then, from the doorway of a nearby shop, the butler appeared, tall and elegant in his bowler hat and white gloves. He carried the new pick and shovel over his shoulder, the washpan under his arm, and a strange package wrapped in newspaper, and a string dangling freely from his hand. Jack had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. "Hurry!" he cried desperately. "We'll get left behind." "Not likely," said Praiseworthy. "I had to stop off and make a small purchase for our good Captain Jack himself. Come along, Master Jack." Jack tried to not let Praiseworthy see that he had been close to tears. He threw the pick and shovel across one shoulder, gathered up the washpan, and together the boy and butler hurried themselves towards the wharf. One by one, alley cats picked up their trail. By the time they reached the ship, it looked as if every stray stray cat in Gallo was after them. Before the gangway could be raised, at least 12 assorted cats followed Praiseworthy aboard. In their stocking caps, the crew was too busy throwing off hawsers and preparing for sea to bother with the invasion of Peruvian cats. Jack dropped the heavy pick and shovel with a clang to the dock and looked at Praiseworthy's package. "A dead rat?" he asked. "Hardly," said the butler. "Cheese? Not likely. Fresh kidney?" "Exactly," said Praiseworthy, raising the package out of reach of the cats. "Captain Swain is extraordinary fond of kidney pie. I promised to teach the cook an old recipe my great-grandfather had to prepare for the Duke of Chisley. But at the moment, Captain Swain was in no temper for kidney pie. The ship had taken on fresh water, but not an ounce of coal. "Blast the Sea Raven!" he was bellowing. She's filled her bunkers and piled her decks with coal. Hills of it, mountains of it. Taken every lump of it to Gallo. She's made sure there wasn't a cinder left for us." Once at sea, the Lady Wilma picked up a friendly breeze. If her coal bunkers were empty, she was at least lighter in the water, and went skimming along her course. The Peruvian cats learned to bound out of sight every time the husky-throated boatswain came along, threatening to toss her overboard. In an unguarded moment, a snap of the wind carried off Praiseworthy's bowler hat. It went tumbling into the sea, filled with water, and sank. Praiseworthy was left speechless and hatless. For 3 or 4 days he was not quite himself. He missed the hat. He hardly felt like a butler without it. But Jack thought it looked just fine. A week later, as the heat bore down on the deck, Praiseworthy began tying a handkerchief around his neck. Jack liked that even better. "You look like a pirate," he smiled. "Nonsense, Master Jack," said Praiseworthy, hoping for a supply of coal. Captain Swain dropped anchor in the Galapagos, but there was nothing to be had except a few cords of stovewood on the barren islands. There was even less to see except the sharks in the bay. The Lady Wilma pushed on. With the rush for gold, steamers were only just being sent around the Horn to the Pacific, and fueling stops were rare. Weeks later, off the coast of Mexico, a sudden excitement raced along the decks of the gold ship. The Sea Raven had been sighted. She was lumbering through the sea, low in the water, weighted by her extra tons of coal. They stood in enormous black piles on her weather decks. "Billy be hanged!" shouted Master Jim. "We're going to pass her up." I'm going to stop right there just because we're getting to the end of the race. And so I was thinking as I was reading this, wow, the Sea Raven's pretty tricky and smart by taking all the coal, right? Because they knew that it would slow down, or it would make it harder for what is our ship? The Bull of the Seas to go without fuel, right? But it turns out that being greedy like that and trying to be tricky didn't work for them, at least so far, because it has weighed down their boat. So I just want to stop there, point that out. Interesting. Let's see what happens. I'm getting pretty excited. All right. Jack stood on the rat lines, and his heart raced with delight. The Sea Raven looked half sunken in her sea. Her passengers could be seen at the rails, glum and silent. The Lady Wilma pulled ahead. "By grabs!" Captain Swain beamed, doing a little jig on the paddle box. "I guess if there's anything heavier than a ton of bricks, it's a ton of coal." By the time the brown hills of California appeared off in the port side, the Lady Wilma was in the lead. Meanwhile, the Peruvian cats had Peruvian kittens. I'll drown them, every one of them, swore the boatswain. But he had to catch them first. They ran for cover whenever he approached, disappearing within seconds. They found every hiding place aboard the ship and invented new ones. Jack tried hard to ignore them, for good luck had taught him a lesson. But in the end, he was putting out galley scraps at night. Every morsel would be gone by morning. Dr. Buckbee spent his days fishing, with the line tied around his leg. He would drowse in the sun until a tug roused him. But when his back was turned, the fish would disappear into thin air. The wily cats grew fatter. As San Francisco and the end of their long voyage drew nearer, the gold seekers began to trim their beards again. They packed and replaced their sea chests. They scrubbed their clothes, and they hummed, whistled, and sang at the same time. I'm going to California with a washbowl on my knee. Jack's thoughts raced ahead to the goldfields. What would it be like? Would there be grizzly bears and outlaws and wild Indians? Certainly, he told himself. It was an untamed place, wasn't it? What was the use of an untamed place if there weren't wild Indians and outlaws? And grizzly bears. We ought to have a gun, he told Praiseworthy. A gun? Why? To protect ourselves. Stuff and nonsense, said the butler. But Jack noticed the other gold seekers busily clinging sidearms and rifles and sharpening their knives. He wished he had a gun, a 4-shooter maybe, or even an old army musket with a bayonet. One bright morning, with San Francisco not more than a day's run, the bountiful winds died away. By afternoon, clouds had gathered in the sky, and the headwinds bore down on the gold ship as if to drive her back into the wake. With the steam in their boilers, the Sea Raven came steadily on course. By dusk, she had caught up to the Lady Wilma, passing with the wild shout of glee and victorious blasts of her whistle. Boys, said Mountain Jim, it looks like we're done for. Not a bit, said Praiseworthy on his way into the pilot house. The Lady Wilma was already making a wide tack in the wind. She might be blown hundreds of miles off course, even as far as the Sandwich Islands. The voyage isn't finished, sir, not by a long shot. But even to Jack, with the wind snapping at his shirt, it seemed that the Lady Wilma's luck had run out. Captain Swain would lose command of the new clipper ship building on the ways in Boston. Jack dug his hands in his pockets and glanced up to the pilot house. The wild bull of the sea didn't have a lump of coal to fight the headwinds. Jack was asleep in his hammock when he was roused by a strange sound. At first, he thought it must be Mr. Azariah Jones snoring in his sleep, or Mountain Jim, or Dr. Buckbee. But they came awake too. A deep throb ran through the ship, and then another. The splash of the side wheels could be heard, and then another, and another. The gold seekers bounded out of their bunks, some of them in their nightcaps, and collected on the deck. Sparks were flying from the funnel. Steam had been built up in the boilers. What's the captain burning? Mountain Jim, scratching his whiskers. Cats? Hardly, said Praiseworthy above the crash of the side wheels. He gave Jack a wink. Neither cats, nor bricks, nor spoiled potatoes, as a stowaway could tell you. Gentlemen, we're carrying lumber into our cargo holds. Thousands of feet of it, lumber enough to build a hotel. It occurred to Captain Swain to purchase what he needs with the ship's fuel count. Makes a fine shower of sparks, doesn't it? But the race was not yet won, and Jack could sleep no more that night. He pulled on an old pea jacket. The frog-voiced bosun had handed down to him, and stood with Praiseworthy at the rail. This would be their last night aboard the ship after all. The paddle wheels twirled faster and faster, and the bowsprit came around on course, like a compass needle. "It was you, wasn't it?" Jack grinned. "Me, Master Jack. You told the captain about the lumber." "Oh, he knew it was there, but with all of this storming about the bricks in the hold, he hadn't stopped to give the lumber a thought. I merely reminded him, you might say." In the dark of the morning, the Lady Wilma had managed to gain on the Sea Raven. The gold ships thrashed bowsprit to bowsprit, and the red glow of their smokestacks lit up in the surrounding sea. "More lumber!" shouted Captain Swain in his voice into the tube. "I want every ounce of the steam boiler hold, and then some." The Sea Raven, too, was making a final sprint. By noon, the Golden Gate stood ahead of them, but the hour burden of her mountains of the deck coal was too much for the Sea Raven. Beat by beat, her side wheels, the Lady Wilma pulled slowly ahead. Wood sparks showered from her funnel. She entered the sparkling narrows of the Golden Gate and finally came into San Francisco Bay. The city stretched out across the sand dunes like something that had sprung up the night before. There seemed to be more ships in the harbor than houses on shore. "Let go the anchor," Captain Swain shouted from the pilot house window. A moment later, the anchor chain went rattling into the bay, and hats went flying in the air. Beaver hats and straw hats and even a cat or two. Praiseworthy and Jack gathered up their picks and shovels and washpins and carpetbags and peered at the golden hills of San Francisco. The houses looked like packing boxes with roofs, and tents of every description were pitched along the dunes. "Gentlemen," said Praiseworthy, tugging on his white gloves, "I believe we've won the race." After a 15,000-mile voyage and 5 months at sea, the gold seekers had arrived. Well, that's cool. Do you think that the Bull of the Sea, Captain Swain's ship, do you think that they would have beat the Sea Raven if Praiseworthy wasn't aboard? Something to think about. Put that in the comments. And I will see you guys back here for Chapter 8. Bye.